Can you say something? Oh. Hello and welcome to our CBC Manitoba panel. CBC Manitoba has been in the University of Manitoba UMSU building, the Fireside Lounge, for the past couple of weeks. It's part of our Communities in Focus project, and that's where we go to different parts of the province and spend time, 1 week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, in different communities so we can better get to know those communities and better reflect those stories in our news. And we have decided that we need to get to know Gen Z better, and that's why we're here at the University of Manitoba. Last week we had a panel discussion, Gen Z on politics, and this week the topic of our discussion is Gen Z on media. I've joined now with 3 students from the University of Manitoba, all of whom consume media, whether that's kind of mainstream legacy media, also social media, and all have different kind of perspectives on media. So I'm going to introduce my panel now. We have Carl Pulver. Hi, Carl.
Hi, great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Carl, what first got you interested in news media, in news?
Oh, in news?
Yeah, what was it? Was it an event?
Well, not particularly. I've been interested in just news media forever. I've followed it my whole life, just kind of upbringing around it. Very interested in just what's going on in the world.
Okay, so do you remember like the earliest memory of you being interested? Because you're 20, right? So when you say forever, that's...
Yeah, for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, it came with an interest in history.
Okay.
When I was young, I was very interested in kind of what has happened in the world.
What's your earliest memory of being interested in what's happening in the world?
Probably I was looking at something that I was living in the United States, and it was Barack Obama's election, and I was very, very young, and I remember just thinking, wow, this is like everything's moving around me.
Interesting.
And I want to know what that's about.
Okay, great. We're also joined by Kira Campbell. Hi, Kira.
Hi.
What do you remember the first news event that you were interested, or what got you interested in news?
Yeah, definitely. I was kind of the weird political kid in my small rural schools. So I was always kind of interested in news, and I'd say the first news that I noticed was actually on Afghanistan. My family and I would watch like CTV at supper time every single night, and we'd see stories about, soldiers who weren't coming home, and that was the first kind of like conscious moment I remember seeing the news, and ever since I've just been hooked on the news.
Interesting. I feel like you're all the 3 weird political kids who are interested. You might be the only 3 on the campus, I don't know. Thanks, Kira. Prabnoor Singh. Hello, Prabnoor. You're also 20, like Carl. Do you remember that first news event that got you hooked or interested in news?
I don't necessarily recall the first big event that got me into the news.
Yeah.
But I do recall, for example, I started paying attention to the news, whether it was through paper or through news channels on the TV, when I was in elementary or middle school, because we would talk about current affairs and what's happening around the world. with my classmates, and my teacher would always ask us every morning, what's some big event happening around the world? So I always want to be the one that raises their hand up and be like, oh, Mr. Roy, I know what's happening in the class or in the world. So that's what got me into news, is just trying to know and see what's happening around the world.
Shout out to Mr. Roy, who inspired this love of news. How typical are the three of you of your generation when it comes to interest in the news?
I think it really depends. I feel like there is a very strong interest in the news amongst Gen Z, but where that comes from varies very wildly. So I think we're a very politically aware generation in general. And I think that comes from exposure and growing up with media being an ever-present sort of factor in our lives.
Particularly social media, right?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, we are political nerds maybe, and I think I might be in a bit of an echo chamber, on Instagram stories. All the people I follow will always post about the news, what's going on in the United States right now, everything like that. So I definitely think that, there is a lot of news going on that I interact with, but I don't know if that's the same for the rest of Gen Z.
Do you talk about news with your friends?
Yeah, I personally do.
Yeah.
I would disagree. I think my friends usually talk about other topics instead of what's happening around the world. We'll be talking about our class and like what we're studying and maybe what's happening in our daily lives, for example, whether it's relationship matters, family matters, our personal struggles, stuff like that. Especially amongst my close friends, I think news is really less brought up.
Okay.
But aside from that, I think everyone nowadays is an influencer on social media. Everyone wants to be the person that posts that picture and other people repost it.
All right.
So everyone on social media uses it as a platform to get their views out there, share it amongst folks, and try to be the next viral sensation.
Well, everyone has their own platform now, right? I want to get to social media in a second because that's obviously a huge part of this discussion. And Kira, you talked about echo chambers, but let's just stay with mainstream media for 1 second. I was actually surprised that all three of you consume mainstream or legacy media outlets because of this idea that your generation, Gen Z, gravitates more towards social media. So you consume legacy media, you obviously trust it, but what criticisms do you have of what mainstream or legacy media covers or how it covers? Carl.
I'll start. I feel like mainstream media definitely does have a tendency, especially with the opinion pieces, to isolate its consumers, especially younger people. I feel like younger people are looking for a lot of perspectives that simply aren't offered in legacy media. And I feel like looking at trends and kind of like opinion of legacy media outlets, it is sort of irreflective of a lot of the key interests of Gen Z.
Okay, fair enough. Kira, what are your criticisms?
I would say one of my biggest criticisms as of late was the coverage of what's going on in Gaza and Palestine currently. When I woke up that morning after October 7th, I went to Twitter first, or X. I didn't go to the mainstream CBC, CTV, BBC, because I had a feeling that the coverage, there might not be that much coverage, and my assumptions were correct. I found the coverage quite skewed or not covered at all, and I think that's been a continuing trend throughout what's going on in Gaza.
Do you think it's improved?
No, I don't think it's improved. I think especially following the ceasefire, the news has it's fallen off a bit. I think when we hear about hostages released, there's a bit of a pickup, but I really don't think that there's a full coverage of what's still going on there and in the West Bank as well.
Okay. Prabnur, what about you? What are your criticisms?
I think there tends to be a bias sometimes that news outlets have towards maybe the person that's in power in government. That's been very visible from the country that I come from, in India, for example, where news outlets won't criticize the government or only publish news that favors the current government in power and stuff like that. Aside from that, there's been a lot more emphasis and focus towards global issues, and I feel like because of that, what's been happening at a local level, that does not get the highlight that it deserves sometimes. Everyone's too focused about what's happening in, for example, the United States, or even in a global perspective around the world. You'll hear more often about what's happening in the U.S. than what's happening in your local country, in your local constituency. And because of that, local issues sometimes don't get the representation they deserve.
So that's interesting because Kira's saying there's not enough coverage of international events. You're saying there's actually a lot of coverage, but maybe that's specifically the US and specifically Donald Trump and specifically the conversation around tariffs. I just want to bring to light that, we tried really hard on this panel to actually find someone who just doesn't trust mainstream media, perhaps a bit more right-leaning. Carl, I put you on a bit of a mission to find that perspective. What were the responses that you were getting? Because they exist, they're on the campus.
Yeah, they certainly exist. Lots of people, especially right-leaning young people, have very little trust for mainstream media, especially in Canada, almost, more than any other country on earth. I don't know if that's maybe too general, but you understand my meaning. I feel like a lot of people are very dissatisfied with legacy media, especially right-leaning young men is the demographic I think of, who see that the issues that they hear about, and because they trust, say like social media sources or like traditional media sources, they're told, look at this is like something that the media is pushing, this perspective, this is totally not true. And then instead of mainstream outlets sort of responding to that as like, oh, here's something that we think that you think of, it's kind of doubling down, and it's just caused this rift that's really not mending itself.
Because you were asking people, and I was asking people and reaching out to people, and people don't, that perspective in particular, they're on the campus, but they just don't feel comfortable coming on in a forum like this. Do you think there's an element of truth that we should pay attention to in that perspective? We're all looking at each other, waiting. Carl, go.
Yeah, so I do think there are some elements of truth in that perspective. I think that a lot of people who don't trust mainstream media do so for a reason. Like you said, that there are several international issues that even on like the left, people will veer away from mainstream media outlets and just completely lose confidence in the legacy media's ability altogether to address issues that they really care about. I think that one of the main barriers put up to getting a better conversation in general on legacy media is this fact that people are told not to trust, and that kind of creates a cycle.
Kira?
Yeah, I definitely am quite worried about, I guess, this rise of alternative media, not in the sense of more media sources, but kind of this rise of the podcasters, I guess I could say. I think that anyone kind of goes out now and thinks if they get a mic and a couple friends, then their political opinions are gold. And I do find that quite worrisome, especially for young males. I haven't seen a lot of top podcasts that are covering issues that non-binary people and women really care about, or they kind of brush them off. So I do think that there is definitely this distrust of the mainstream media, and they have to figure out how to kind of gain that trust again, or these podcasts will pick up even more steam than they are.
Okay, so this is a perfect segue into my next conversation. I want to talk about Joe Rogan. What do we all think? Prabnur, you will listen. Do listen.
Yes, I do listen to Joe Rogan's podcast, and I'm not an extreme fan of it, but I listen to depending on who the guest is at the show, for example, trying to get to know that individual better. So I feel like it depends on who the guest is for me. And instead of like the views, I'm trying to get to understand and get to know the guests better through that podcast, instead of just believing that whatever individual is saying is true.
Yeah, so you feel that that forum, that podcast is a way for you to be able to do that. Carl, you have some thoughts on Joe Rogan and what he represents?
Yeah, I have some complicated thoughts on Joe Rogan.
I love complicated thoughts, more complication, more nuance.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do listen to Joe Rogan occasionally. I mean, he's not my go-to by any means, but especially like kind of earlier on, not so much recently. But I do think Joe Rogan, just as a character, which he sort of is, he's kind of a collective character in the public conscious nowadays. I feel like he is a good reflection of popular attitudes in especially America. I think that Joe Rogan has a really big impact, especially like on public opinion and sway and things like that. But I don't think it's because of his own takes on the world. I think it's just who he chooses to have on, how people respond to that, and how just generally like now say like he has had quite a few right-wing people come and speak, quite a few people who say will spread misinformation deliberately and other sorts of things. And I think that has caused a rift by making it harder for, say, progressively minded individuals to even engage with that in the first place. And I think he would have those people on. He would talk to them. But there's, again, a rift there.
There's an argument, though, that the reason why he is so popular is that he does give space to perspectives that perhaps mainstream media have dismissed, demonized for maybe legitimate reasons. But is there something important about having a space where we can hear different opinions without it being censored, whether you agree or disagree? Kira?
I think to an extent. I think not everyone needs to be platformed. I don't think.
Who decides?
That's a great question. Maybe Joe Rogan, apparently. I think that the way, especially going back to the U.S. again, we can't ignore it, seeing like what Trump is choosing to do in his presidency, the EDI of it all and everything, are a lot of things that these people who are platformed have been spewing for the past X amount of months throughout the campaign. And I think that it's gaining a lot of traction and it's really dangerous. So I think people who have these podcasts have a deep responsibility to consider who they're platforming on their podcasts.
Speaking, of Joe Rogan, a Canadian public figure like Jordan Peterson, for example, who has been on the Joe Rogan podcast many times, and one could argue was kind of dismissed or demonized by mainstream media. Carl, you have some kind of thoughts about that experience in particular, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a great case study into sort of how we can kind of create a cycle to drive someone to a place that maybe they didn't start at. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about whether I agree with Peterson himself. I think he has a lot of misunderstandings. But one thing I think is he started as someone who was far more understanding and willing. Like he went out and said like, oh, I am in support of people who come to me. I'm just not in support of like government. And of course, like people can say
in terms of pronouns, right?
In terms of pronouns.
Yeah.
But then he kind of moved on. People kind of adopted him as a symbol, like he was very early to this kind of collective debate, and he became a symbol of it. And he kind of slowly goes into this further and further right-wing view to, at this point, I don't think he's accepting it all. But I do think that was created by a media landscape that deliberately sort of looked at this, went, okay, here's our figure for this sort of position, even if it was far more complicated than that to begin with.
Okay. Prabnu, you're very interested in local news. Tell me like what your kind of routine is in terms of consuming local news and how you perhaps identify what you believe, what you trust, and what's accurate to you.
Some of the things that I do on the usual is, for example, every morning when I'm getting ready, I'll have the YouTube app open and I'll be listening to CBC Manitoba or Winnipeg Live to sort of see, for example, what the weather conditions are like in my city, what's happening in my travel route, or what's happening within the city. For example, recently there was about 10 cases of overdose that happened. So stuff like that, just kind of listening as I'm getting ready for the day, listening what's happening in my city and just getting it through there. There's also sometimes ethnic or local media channels that I listen to or my parents listen to often that cover local news. There's small news outlets that are run by individuals or like a small team of two to three people that cover local events and local occurrences and local achievements and stuff like that. So that's where ethnic media, I guess, comes in as well, and helps me out finding local news.
Yeah. You all kind of reference social media, so I want to kind of turn to that now. How do you gauge whether what you're consuming on social media is accurate, is trustworthy? Kira, what's your process?
Yeah, so in my undergraduate degree, one of my professors actually made us aware of this website called News Biased Fact Check. So this is great for, if you're getting news from websites, you can kind of see where they lean. Have there been a lot of discrepancies in their work? So I think that's a really good place to start if you're thinking of sharing something on social media from one of these news sources. But then with social media, if I see something shared on someone's Instagram story, I will often take it at face value, but that is because I'm very much in this echo chamber that I've kind of created for myself, as a lot of us have.
Are you worried about being in an echo chamber?
To an extent, yeah.
So what are you doing about it?
Yeah, I would say that's kind of why I've kept myself on X, as painful as it can be sometimes. I do get a lot of stories from, news sources that I don't usually go to. And those kind of, I would say, keep me in a little bit of a realistic mindset.
Yeah. I want to stay on the theme of social media. Carl, when you go on your social media, you're interested in the comments as much as the posts, or if not more than the posts. What are you observing about the comments?
Absolutely. I think
feed?
it's the comment section is actually one of the more interesting parts to look at when looking at news stories, because it's your immediate reaction from kind of anyone who's willing to say their piece. And for better or for worse, sometimes you get comment sections that are dominated by one opinion that is not reflective of the whole debate. But I just find it the most interesting section, just because it's like a direct, oh, look, that's what my friend is saying, and that is crazy.
And are you surprised by some of the comments that your friends are saying? Are there trends that you're noticing?
Yeah, I mean, I do recognize there's like a divide clearly amongst a lot of people. I do think more kind of deterministic worldviews, if that makes sense. Like I am a left-wing person who believes in all of this, and this is very like the way that it informs my worldview. You see people comment on that like kind of like a framework consistently, but I've overwhelmingly seen like more people kind of shift right and comment on like something with this take that you hear like all the time on social media, but it's like clearly gets into people's heads and they think about it. So.
And these are people you know, presumably?
Some people I know.
And are you surprised that you're seeing a shift amongst your friends to the right?
Not so much. I feel like if you kind of pay attention to media trends, especially on social media for the past many years, to me it's not surprising to see a shift to the right when kind of the left has not had the same volume on the internet. They haven't had the same noise generated for their whatever they believe. And when they do, they tend to tear each other apart on smaller issues. So,
Prabnur, you used to post political posts on your social media, but you stopped. Why is that?
So here's one of the major reasons I would say is that whenever there was a political post that someone posted and I would repost it, or what would happen is I'll see that there's like tens and hundreds of people that are reposting the same thing, and I just realized that my social media platform is supposed to be my personal portfolio, and maybe I don't want to share my values or my takes on certain opinions publicly, fearing some sort of hatred coming from people that follow me, for example. I feel like just for my own peace of mind, my own safety, I decided that it's better to, instead of arguing with people online through social media, it's just better to keep not a low key, but like somewhat of a personalized approach to social media. And I instead post pictures I take or artwork and stuff like, or milestones that I've achieved in life instead of my political opinions or stuff like that.
Because it can get quite heated.
It gets quite heated, and there's, for example, you've mentioned X multiple times. I've seen people post their political opinions on X, and then they'll have like comments from trolls and fake accounts, and it's just like, people are using fake accounts to just hate on each other. There's no point in that.
So do you worry then, because Kira, you mentioned echo chambers a couple of times, do you worry that the social media environment where a lot of people and a lot of Gen Z are kind of spending their time, are you concerned at how polarized it's become, and what does that mean for the way you think about the world?
Yeah, I definitely don't think there's this kind of set of respectful rules that anyone follows on social media. I do post my political takes. I talk about politics a lot. I think it's part of my personal identity. And I think it's important to share stories so that they're elevated, especially if they aren't elevated maybe on mainstream media. But I've definitely gotten comments or direct messages that, aren't the nicest. And I think that it is very polarizing, and I'm not sure what we do about it. Right now, it doesn't really seem like there's a solution to it, especially with this kind of right-wing rise. I feel like people maybe who were kind of shy to share their thoughts maybe in years past don't feel that shame anymore due to leaders that we see around the world. So I really don't know how to stop this trajectory, unfortunately.
How open-minded are you to different perspectives?
I would say I'm very open-minded. Like I said, I've kept X, and I find stories that are posted. I also check the comments. I find them very interesting, just to remind myself to kind of realize that, there are other people with all these other views, and I think it's really important to understand them and try to understand where these people are coming from. And usually I find that it's from a source of either pain or fear of the other side.
Yeah, which you have empathy for, presumably?
Absolutely.
Will legacy media die with your generation? Where do you feel the future is going to be for mainstream media outlets and Gen Z? Carl?
I don't think it's going to die. I think that legacy media still plays such a major role in informing public opinion, informing people of our generation, whether that be directly or indirectly. Of course, legacy media is the only type of media with the infrastructure to get to a lot of these stories first, right? So you'll see like a social media post. Often, if not most, social media kind of public opinion or even like alternative media sources of opinion usually are getting whatever they're saying from a legacy media source or kind of expanding on that or responding to it, right? So I think it very much has a place still in the ecosystem. The influence it wields, though, I think is going to diminish quite significantly.
Kira, what about you? What are your thoughts? Like you said, when, after October 7th, you go to social media to get your news about what's happening in Gaza before mainstream media. So do you feel that there's going to be a decline in mainstream media's reach?
Even though I have critiques of mainstream media, I still think it's absolutely central to what we consume. Going back to, at the dinner table with my family, watching CTV, CBC, whatever is on that night, I think it's also really important for community building. Coming from a rural area where most of our local news has kind of been defunded, I think having these mainstream sources that communities are able to kind of share their stories and rally around is super important. I really hope it doesn't die out. I don't think it will, but I do agree with Kyle's point that, does it have that influence that it used to? And I'm not sure.
Prabnor, you talked before about how you listen to Joe Rogan, for example. Do you think mainstream media has anything to learn from alternative media like Joe Rogan's approach to giving space to different voices?
I would say so, that instead of promoting just one side of the story or promoting a certain vision that mainstream media has, bring on board people that might have a different opinion and give them the space to talk about what they want to talk about. It might not be something that we agree with, but once again, having empathy for the other individual, for example, and just listening to their perspective and letting them talk, I feel like that'll be a good way for legacy media to kind of still be the largest fish in the pond, I would say.
You're nodding, Kira? You're okay with that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do think that these podcasters have this really important role to kind of, explain why they're platforming the people that they're platforming. And I love to see more media. I think it's great. But I do think that mainstream media has to kind of keep up with that and keep up with the times as well. And I think things like what we're doing today are a great way to do that.
Thank you. I just want to hear from the audience. Is there anyone in the audience who doesn't trust the media? Put your hands up, like mainstream media. I want to bring Milan, Luke's, not that he doesn't trust the mainstream media, I'm sure, let's find out. He is the editor. If you want to take a, come here, Milan. You're the editor-in-chief of the Manitoban, the student newspaper. What have you heard from the panel today that resonates with you, or perhaps you disagree with?
Yeah, it's a good question, Nadia, and thank you for this chance. I really liked how you talked about the death of the legacy media to get perspectives from my fellow colleagues here. I guess a question that I'd have for these panelists here is, you might not be aware, but the federal government actually gives out over $500 million each year, over $500 million in federal subsidies. So a lot of news organizations, and I'll give you an example, local here, the Free Press, they get millions of dollars in federal subsidies, which some people call a media bailout, but to persist, they get millions of dollars from the federal government. And it's not just the Free Press, it's a whole bunch of other media organizations across the country. A lot of them rely on these federal subsidies, which at one point in history didn't exist. So my question for you is, if certain legacy media outlets, if they constantly need millions of dollars to persist, is that a good stewardship or a good use of public funds? If a company constantly needs millions and millions of dollars in handouts, if they're not able to, run off of just their subscriptions alone or just their ad revenue, if they constantly need millions of dollars in revenue, is that a good thing? Or maybe perhaps then the business model that they're running is not the best and those funds could be better used elsewhere?
Thanks, Milan. Thank you. Anyone from the panel want to take that on? Carl?
Yeah, I think part of this is, yes, I do think media does need to adapt their business model in order to reduce some of these costs. But also, majorly, I think in Canada, we can put forward the idea that Canadian perspectives are very drowned out in the media landscape. This is just a fact that we are a country of, I guess, 40 million now, right next to a country of 300 million, right? Just by population alone, the amount of people interested in American topics is going to far outweigh those in Canadian. So I do think that Canadian perspectives need to be supported by the Canadian government. I think that we need to say, hey, look, we have something to say, especially on a local level, and our issues are important. So you might not ever say someone like Joe Rogan, just as an example, might never bring a Canadian on, right? Just by sheer, I'm not interested in Canada. Why would I be, right? That might be changing recently, but it's a real problem, and I think that Canadians need to sort of support each other and our stories. So I think that it's a good use of tax dollars, personally.
Thank you for your question, Milan, and thank you to my panel today for this conversation. Carl, Kira, Prabnur, really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. This conversation will be live streamed on YouTube. We really appreciate our audience as well coming in today. This is all part of CBC Manitoba's Communities in Focus, and we've been here at the University of Manitoba for the past couple of weeks listening to students, and we're still here today and tomorrow, so if you are here on campus, come by to the Fireside Lounge and share your perspectives with us. It's really important that we reflect those on our platforms and in our news coverage. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Yes, a round of applause.